everybody. I'm Margaret Mountford. I'm the president of the Society for the Promotion of Hellenic Studies, and I'd like to welcome you all to this event this evening. Now, I'm sure many of you are members of the Hellenic Society already. Hands up anyone who isn't a member.
I used to be.
Right.
Society, I'm afraid.
Well, it's not, you know, you are allowed to be members of both. There's no penalty. And you can borrow more books. Anyway, I'm going to talk a bit more about on the basis that I'm not just preaching to the converted and even possibly to the lapsed. I will say a little bit more about the society at the end, but there is a flyer. There are flyers dotted around which I'd urge you to read. Now, tonight's lecture is the first in the 2024 Green Lecture Series. Professor Richard Green, who was an ICS Fellow for many years, who's now in Australia, gave the Society a very generous donation to support a series of lectures with an emphasis on archaeology. This enables us to invite someone based outside the UK and whom we wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity of hearing to deliver a series of lectures in London and other UK locations every 2 years. This is the second series. The first was given 2 years ago by Dr. Victoria Sabatai from Athens. So we're delighted that this year's lectures are being given by Dr. Lindy Crewe, Director of the Cyprus American Archaeological Research Institute. Dr. Crewe obtained her PhD from Edinburgh, writing on the introduction of wheel-made pottery on late Bronze Age Cyprus, and lectured in archaeology in Manchester before joining CAARI in 2017. I understand she was also at the British Museum for a year, so she's well used to these shores. Her latest book, Empire and Excavation, is due out next year, and she's currently directing excavations at a Bronze Age settlement near Paphos. We're very fortunate that Lindy's giving 2 lectures in London, today's and the second on the 7th of October, also in this room, and is also speaking in Belfast, Cambridge and Nottingham as part of this series. Cyprus is the most fascinating island with a wealth of history and prehistory. So I'm not going to take up any more of your time now, and I will hand over to Lindy to talk about beef and beer, working and feasting on Bronze Age Cyprus.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for the introduction, and thank you to the Hellenic Society for sponsoring this, and of course to Dick Green for his contribution for making this happen as well. And I hope Dick enjoys it when he gets to watch it on YouTube. And it is fantastic to be back in London, despite the grey weather. It's very nice to be here and see everyone. So I am going to talk about beef and beer, working and feasting on Bronze Age Cyprus. But before I launch into that, I would like to tell you all a little bit about the Cyprus American Archaeological Research Institute, CAARI. We are located in downtown Nicosia, right near the Old Town, near the Cyprus Museum, near the Archaeological Research Unit of the University of Cyprus, in this lovely listed historic building in the centre of town, where we've just done major refurbishments and renovations. We have underground basement library storage, wheelchair access for the library, and our residents upstairs can host, well, we have 8 rooms and we can host up to 14 researchers if students are willing to share. And it's a very convivial and lovely place to do your research. The heart of the Institute is our library, named after Claude Chauffeur, as his collections were purchased by Stuart Swinney, a previous director, from his widow upon his death. And what I'd like to highlight particularly to this audience is our fellowships. So we have 3 fellowships available for postgraduate students, and only one of these is designated as to be used by a Canadian or US university student. The other 2 are for students of any nationality. We also recently inaugurated the Edgar Peltenberg Fellowship in Cypriot Prehistory through generous donations from Eddie's widow, Diane Bolger, and former student Carol McCartney, as well as other donations. And this allows a recently completed PhD student to spend 9 months living at CAARI with a stipend, getting their publications in order and figuring out what they would like to do for their next career move. So we're very proud of that. We have 2 fellowships for senior US researchers from the Council of American Overseas Research Centers, and we have a Scholar in Residence Fellowship available to any nationality, a 50% discount. So I would like to encourage everyone to take a look at our website and consider doing your research on Cyprus and applying for one of our fellowships, which are now open, with a deadline of December for the junior ones and January for the senior ones. So back to our topic of the day. Beer and beef, working and feasting on Bronze Age Cyprus. So I'm interested in the role that communal consumption events may have played in shaping Bronze Age Cypriot society, and how these events may have been manipulated to create unequal social relationships, particularly at this key time we're going to be hearing about, which is the transformation from village-based to the beginnings of urbanism on Cyprus. And how these materials and ritual processes to do with both the recipes, the ingredients, and the technologies, the techniques of making and of building may have been entwined, possibly for apotropaic purposes at this critical juncture, or for other reasons. And scale is important here because we are moving from domestic household scales to industrial scales at this time when we're seeing this leap towards an outward-looking Cyprus wanting to become part of Eastern Mediterranean trading systems and the wider world. So I'm going to take you on a tour around some of the areas of my excavation at Kasonaga Skalia near Paphos, and also draw upon the rich figurative record which we have from around the island. One of our examples, this little smiley guy here, he is decorated in our local Western Cypriot Bronze Age style with these incised lines filled with lime paste. All of them around the island have these pierced ears. He would have had originally a little turban hat, but that has been knocked off and he has been modified. So what do we know about Cypriot early Middle Bronze Age settlement patterns? Not a great deal, sadly, and we would definitely like to know a great deal more. You can see here we have the various phases. Our initial Filia phase, which is the transition between the Chalcolithic to the Bronze Age from around about 2500 BC. Very few sites marked in yellow here. In the center of the island at Marchialonia, if I can do this, and out here at Kasonaga Skalia, and then a few test trenches done in the 1940s and 50s. Early Cypriot proper starts around 2200 BC. We have a few sites attested here. The Middle Bronze Age around about 2000 BC, and we're starting to see more sites attested. And it's this key Middle Cypriot 3 to Late Cypriot 1A final phase that I've shown, which is really this transition from the earlier part of the Bronze Age to the Late Bronze Age, and all of these sites that you see here are abandoned at that juncture. So we have a lot of discontinuities in the archaeological record, largely as it seems because Cyprus was never suffering great population pressures. So if people were fed up with the leadership of their village or just decided they wanted something new, it seems that there were opportunities for just relocating, even if sometimes it's only a couple of 100 meters. So we don't have very many long stratigraphic sequences. And I'm happy to say Kasonaga is one of the exceptions where we do. Our other problem, of course, is this year is 50 years since 1974, since the coup and the invasion. And since that time, the northeastern third of the island has been not under the control of the Republic of Cyprus and is only recognized by Turkey. And hence UNESCO conventions forbid archaeology in contested territories and war zones. We've had no legitimate excavation in that part of the island since then. And you can see from this line that earlier 20th century focus was on cemetery excavations largely, for the retrieval of whole objects from tombs for export to display in museums abroad. And since 74, archaeological research questions have changed. We're more interested in how people lived than the goods they might have been buried with, and this imbalance is really striking now. And note particularly the yellow circle of the copper sources at the pillow lavas encircling the central Troodos range, obviously in the Bronze Age, bronze important, and Cyprus being a renowned source of copper in the region. So what we do know now is that there wasn't a sudden leap from living in little villages. We seem to see an increase in site specialization occurring over the Middle Bronze Age, and particularly increasing throughout the period. This site, Ambeliku, has evidence for pottery production as well as copper smelting site. We have down here a very lovely textile workshop at Arimi Launen Tupureku. Kalopsida, renowned for the manufacture of these white painted ware juglets, and presumably the contents that were going in these juglets as we find them exported around the Eastern Mediterranean region at this time. And Kasonaga Skalia, we've got increasing specialization and exciting products going on there, not that we know what they all are. So I mentioned that all those previous sites were abandoned, and now we get to the point where we have the first, what we call monumental architecture on Cyprus, although by mainland standards it may not be considered so. But some important sites up in the Karpas Peninsula, the fortified keep at Nitavikla, the Enkmi Area 3 fortification shown here. Up in the top, this structure at Flamoudi might have been a gathering centre for the community or a watchtower to look out over the coast. And down the bottom, tantalising trenches where we see wider than normal exterior walls and narrower internal walls at Kalopsida. And now Karimi has a beautiful enclosing circular wall as well. And we have the final phase complex at Kasonaga Skalya we're going to hear about today. So the important aspect here is the move to the coast. All those little inland places, generally 5 kilometres from the sea, abandoned. New agricultural communities were founded, of course, but the important late Bronze Age towns are located around the coast. Kasonaga Skalya is exceptional in that we're already on the coast from this initial filial phase. So coming to the village of Kasonaga, you can see here we are located in this 1/4 hectare plot. This other circle is the roofed area open to the public of the important Neolithic to Chalcolithic site of Kasonaga Mosfilia, excavated by Eddie Peltenberg. And just the other circle is just the village church in the center of the village, just for a little reminder. So we're sandwiched here between an increasingly expanding village, an increasingly expanding coastal tourist zone, and all the archaeology in this area is highly threatened by development. This 1963 aerial photo might give you more of a flavour of how this village might have been in the past. You can see our 3 points still marked here, and we have 2 streams. The top Scotina stream would have been perennial in prehistory. The lower one may be seasonal or fed by springs. The name Kasonaga is sort of a corruption of Chryso Nero, golden waters, and the village is renowned for its freshwater springs. Down on the coast, 2 small anchorages where boats could be pulled in. It's a very dangerous coastline around here, but we know that there was a Roman warehouse up on this cliff, so it's certainly possible to load and offload boats in this area. And we have basically beautifully located our Kasonaga Skalya final phase complex on this flat area with this gentle slope leading down to the sea just 300 meters hence. So visible to ships and able to see ships that may have been passing. So what does our early middle Cypriot context look like? Typically rectilinear, multi-roomed buildings, stone wall foundations with mud brick superstructures. Typical features we find are things like these plastered post pad and post hole, this emplacement, which might have been for holding big round-based vessels in place or as an inbuilt mortar. And then we have our local pottery up on the left and the right, which was sadly given the name drab polished ware because it was believed to be not as excitingly attractive and shiny and red as the more island-wide red polished ware, which you can see examples of imported ones from Venya in the center of the island and from the north coast up top. And so we have connections with other parts of the island throughout the entire occupation. And then a regular range of the usual groundstone tools and other objects. Some unique objects, this copper fish hook that you see here. We have 2 of these from this area, and they're the only 2 known in the whole of the early Middle Bronze Age, and probably because we are the only known site on the coast. There are some strange habits. They seem to have enjoyed making little nests of stones for juglets and placing juglets in the stone matrix of mud-built benches and other features, but mainly we fit within the pattern of the rest of the island. So coming to our final phase complex. At this stage, the transition from the Middle to Late Bronze Age, we see an ambitious programming of levelling, overbuilding that entire early Middle Bronze Age village that we saw. In the northern area, they cut Bronze Age deposits right down to Chalcolithic levels to create a level platform for building. In the south, they dumped rubble and stones to extend their platform out that way. So it's organised and it's a major programme. And you can see that they wanted to create this very large central space in the middle. But the way they did that, it looks all quite haphazard. They've built this very, very strange, curvilinear, snaky wall by digging a great big 50 centimetre deep foundation trench, 1.2 metres wide, filling it with rubble, and then we have traces of mud brick superstructure. So again, it's a pretty substantial wall, and if it was built up high, easily visible from the coast. They then seem to have floored mud-plastered floors that unify all this. This architecture looks perhaps a little bit more coherent, but they certainly were not very good at right angles at this site. And they have built a very fine entranceway here, concave, very hard mud-plaster floor. But at some point during the use of this complex, they seem to have a problem with water runoff from upslope, and they've dug a series of soak pits or sump pits, big pits full of stones, so when the rain comes in, the rain runs down into the pits instead of running along and ruining their floors. So they built this complex in an organised manner with intention. What this big open space was used for, we do not know. And in fact, we don't really know which side is interior and which side is exterior because it seems to be identical on both sides. We see more evidence for activity alongside the walls, so perhaps a light portico where they could shelter themselves from the sun, but there's no way this was ever entirely roofed. So this is followed by a very last occupation phase of haphazard refurbishments, floor patchings, gradual abandonment perhaps, before they finally leave and don't come back until the Bronze Age is finished. Different people come back. This is the area before where I showed you the early Middle Cypriot architecture, and I'm going to focus on two of our pyrotechnical features that you see here. Note that both of the openings of this are in the sort of southward direction, which might indicate that they were either taking advantage of prevailing winds or trying to protect the contents of these pyrotechnical features from the winds. So what happens to our final phase pottery? Our drab polished continues to some extent, but we have new pottery styles linked to other parts of the island. And particularly we're seeing an island-wide fashion of going from light-faced reddish pottery to dark-faced pottery. The black slips, the red polished floor up there, starting to turn into our proper late Bronze Age types of base ring and things like this. And at the very end, we have large numbers of mended vessels, which you can perhaps make out. So these have been basically broken in antiquity, drilled holes and bound together with perhaps fibre and sealed with wax or something like this. So it might be the case that as the abandonment happened, the potters had gone, the people who were left at the end had to make do. With our new dark face styles comes this new plain white. And as this was what I did my PhD on, as Margaret mentioned, it was pretty astonishing to find one of these vessels in this context that I did not expect it. But the plain white handmade and the plain white wheel made, these are local clay again, absolutely. They have very strong affinities with Eastern styles, these examples from Enkmi down the bottom. And this one in particular, it's a bit of a sad old vessel. They've tried to make with wheel forming technology. It's collapsed. They've had to tie it up with string to stop it falling down. It had a handle attached here, which has fallen off, but the form, the rim shape, is clearly imitating a Levantine transport amphora. So it's not an actual import, but someone who made this has seen one of those. Our plain white handmade pithoi, always with the rolled rim, the flat base, the only pottery with sand embedded in the base. Again, these are technological traits that to me really strongly indicate that we have itinerant potters here, going across the island, making these wares in a variety of local clays. So we've got an increase in movements of people, of Cypriots within Cyprus, as well as an increase of people moving around the Eastern Mediterranean with the Minoans, with the Hyksos, with the Middle Bronze Age Levantine trading emporia. It's an interesting time. So let's come to beer and why we're going to talk about beer today and how that might have impacted on some of these transformations that were going on. First of all, one disadvantage, it's highly resource hungry and it's risky. You need a lot of water, you can go through an awful lot of fuel, Most of these comparisons come from sort of ethnographic parallels in African beer-making communities. Your grain, if you mess up this process, you've lost a large proportion of your grain, which you may not be able to spare, and it's very labor-intensive. It also requires very careful planning and skilled execution, particularly the creation of malt, which I will come to more in a moment. There's a lot of evidence that the maltster in a very particular society was valued as a highly skilled craftsperson, and this was a particular skill. You can't store it, so you make it and you need to drink it. So this creates a sort of anticipation around the process of the production as well, the gathering of the resources. You know that once you've made this product, depending upon weather conditions, you've got sort of a few days or a few weeks in which to consume it. It's very good for you, pre-industrial beer. It's second only to animal proteins in nutrients. And we have a lot of evidence that the entire community is involved, from kids collecting firework and water perhaps, to people sort of making sure the grain is like picking out the stones, and then the skilled maltster, and then the monitoring of it, and then of course everyone coming together for the consumption. So the question we have in this type of context is, who is supplying this grain? Is it the community all contributing a little bit of their stores? Is it someone in the village who has acquired, for example, 2 oxen and is able to plough greater areas of land and plant more grain, and hence start to control the volumes and be able to sort of start to use this resource to try and get people to assist with other tasks? And what about the manufacturing facilities? Is it located in a communal area of the site, or is it in a restricted area of one family's compound? So let's talk about this courtyard where we find one of our pyrotechnical features. Before we get to the entire courtyard, I want to talk about how we came down upon this feature and why we came to the conclusion that it was in fact a malting kiln used for beer production, amongst other things, it has to be said. We don't ever think prehistoric societies only had one function for such a large-scale oven. But you can see here, as we came down, this is in our plough zone, and we are so very lucky to have anything preserved of this site, because the teeth of the plough take our final floors, drag things away, and we feel that this is absolutely amazing that we can get the evidence we can get. But we came down upon very large pieces of concave hard mud plaster, about sort of 6 centimetres thick, up to 75 centimetres in length, and therefore we start to conclude that this is almost certainly a domed oven and not dissimilar in appearance to a traditional village furnos. Although ours is at 2 by 1.5 metres, of a bigger scale than the average village oven. As we excavated into the final use phase, we saw that it was sort of a bit scruffy inside. They had these haphazard, half cleaned out scoops with these ashy silts. So doing something with just hot ash rather than burning on a smaller scale. And this sort of correlates with our final haphazard refurbishing phase, when everything is starting to get a little bit less organized. But we came down to the base to find a very nice, hard-built mud plaster floor with this hard-built mud plaster curb and a pithos in the base. You can see it's been built with the mouth of the pithos right up against the plaster floor here. The pithos itself was full of charcoal. There was a fragmentary cooking pot in the base that had been used to clean out and scoop out the charcoal. On the exterior, in this fill, we found this enigmatic object, this chalk, finely carved tube. You can see on the top here, it's sort of got a convex, thinner top. The middle picture shows a flat, wider base. And you can perhaps make out that both sides have these little divots carved in, and one of them has broken on that side. So it seems to be one component of a multi-component object that has broken, but perhaps it had something with some spring that was sticking into those divots on both sides. I would love if any of the audience can tell me if they've ever seen anything like this. And on the surface, one of our lovely smashed in situ, mended up pots. The pithos itself is a Middle Bronze Age type, not one of our fine, late, plain white ones, but pithos kicks around perhaps for hundreds of years. They're very durable. And then underlying the construction of that feature is another series of ashy scoops, some of them filled with flat stones, some of them with partial pots. So again, it seems like they're using hot ash and a hot stone or a pot inside to heat or dry something gently. And perhaps that oven did not stay around for very long because it was built on such an unstable, soft, ashy, silty matrix. So coming to the full courtyard, what do we have that might relate to ingredients and tools for beer production? We have plenty of water with our 2 streams nearby. The grain, we know that it's wheat or barley on Cyprus, most probably barley in this case, and it has to be malted. Malting just requires you to take the grain and put it in clear, cool, fresh running water, ideally perhaps putting it in a sack, tying it to the side of the stream, letting the water run through, and you have to start the germination process. Once it's begun, you need to cut off the germination process with a very gentle heat, not above 65 degrees. Otherwise, you're going to destroy the enzymes and the sugars that you need to have for the fermentation process. After you've gently heated and dried your malt, you then need to crush it. And then you need to put it in a container with some water and again gently heat it, not above 65 degrees, to make the mash. Then you need yeast to be involved, and that can be wild yeast, can just be attracted to it naturally, or you can add yeast, perhaps from grapes or figs, which are both very good yeast attractors. And then you seal the vessel. You perhaps leave a little hole so the gases can escape and it doesn't explode, and a couple of days you've got your beer. It's as simple as that. So our courtyard, we absolutely have all of these grinding tools. We have a nice in situ smashed cook pot there. We have obviously other activities going on. They're spinning. But we have these sequence here of these ashy scoops. We don't have evidence for intense heat preserved on any of the artifacts. We have a lack of the charcoal except within the pithos itself. And our archaeobotanical evidence, Dr. Leilani Lucas, who's our archaeobotanist, we do our best, we wet sieve everything. Preservation on Cyprus is not good, so we're pretty happy we get what we can. We do have barley, we have grape, quite a large number of fig seeds in there, and a lot of weeds. And weeds are often interpreted, these are the weeds that grow with the crops of barley or wheat, and it's often interpreted as they're used in animal fodder, as the stalks of the grain are also used. So weeds are often interpreted as evidence of dung for fuel, and dung burns at a very low temperature. It's very good for not making too hot a heat, so it's quite possible we're also seeing dung used as fuel. So it's heating and drying, but not cooking. And we have all this equipment we need. So the courtyard itself, if we're saying this is our drying kiln with the pithos retaining the heat, and I'll show you later how this works with circulating hot air up into the higher reaches. We have our inbuilt mortars, grinding tools, juglets. And we do not expect to find juglets so much in settlement contexts. We generally expect to find them in tombs, presumably perfumed oil, medicinal liquids, something very precious that has to be kept in a small container. So, are these juglets containing an ingredient that is being used in the product making here, or is the product being put into the juglets to be then moved on? Not quite sure about that one. So let's take a look at some of our pictorial evidence and see how that can illuminate some of these processes. We're very lucky on Cyprus to have these wonderful scenic compositions. Some of them are little scenes enacted around the outside of pottery vessels. Some of them are clay models. They're generally found in tombs, although we do get fragments in settlements as well. This particular one, the Pyrgos jug, is held to be showing wine production. Happy person standing in a trough with someone with a receptacle below it collecting the liquid. And there's a little person on a donkey here. There's some oxen around here. There's a woman with an infant. There's this person in this strange chair here. But these scenes, as Cariogus interpreted them, as everyday life. So they're really jolly, they're lovely, they're not always super clear as to what exactly these people are doing, but they do help us. One sequence of these vessels, which I believe is really indicative of this process, is a series of vessels that have a complete narrative of the whole agricultural process. You can see there's an oxen here for the ploughing, there's a little donkey with panniers taking the grain in from the fields. We have this scene of people grinding grain, which is absolutely mirrored archaeologically. This example from Satira Kamenuthia here with the setup of the querns and the rubbers. Then you have a little sort of mound of something that is being prepared. Could be dough, could be malt, and a little oven there. And there's other aspects of these scenes, but these are the crucial ones. Apart from this, this is very difficult to decipher, but always there's a miniature vessel, there's a trough-like thing, there's a lump of material there, and there's a person monitoring it, and two people in this case. These vessels, these very rare vessels from Venus, from tombs, depict this scene more clearly. A miniature vessel, trough-like structure, and something pouring into the vessel. This one is even clearer. This is actually the handle of the vessel itself is this trough pouring into the actual sized vessel. And note this really strange spout here. So Stewart, who excavated this, did call them fermentation plants or cult vessels, the idea being that you could ferment beer in these vessels and you have your little spout there for letting the gases escape and it doesn't explode. But these troughs, okay, this is very far removed in space and time to talk about Finland, but these lautering tuns where we have this, you can see now the mash, the liquid that's been made from the germinated grain, they're sort of sieving the liquid off through the mash to make the wort, and this is the sweet fermentable liquid, so you don't have necessarily chunky beer, because we have to remember a lot of pre-industrial beers are quite chunky. So this, I think, is quite plausible, and we're also seeing here, of course, the perishable parts of these toolkits, because we're not going to have preserved the logs that they might have been using as troughs. And non-functional pouring spouts are absolutely a key feature of many of these bowls. Some of these bowls are this big. I mean, lifting it empty is difficult, and lifting it full, well, impossible. And there's certainly no way that the liquid would pour out of that spout before it poured out the edge of the rim. And note here, we've also got an animal, deer, cow, something depicted on the side. And we have plenty of these tubular spouts kicking around at Casonaga Scalia as well. This is one of my favorites, known as the Oxford Bowl. We have the usual very non-functional pouring spout there. We have our lautering tun draining arrangement. We have a deer in this case, definitely, and the little beast behind it interpreted as either a fawn or perhaps a dog, and two clearly male attendants watching over what is known as the enclosed circle with conical lumps motif. These are always circular, either relief or incised, series of little lumps inside, a nice opening in the side here. They've been interpreted as either pottery making, bread making, copper leaching, but they could also be lumps of malt drying. Here are some more examples of these depictions. Again, a clearly male figure guarding this, and note the little bucranium inside that circular arrangement. And these are held to have connections with Anatolian Bronze Age pottery as well, with our introduction to this filial phase. It's held to have connections with Anatolia. This is the only known pithos, so a very large example of one of these vessels. You could store an awful lot of beer inside this. Here again, we've got our people grinding, someone with a lump of stuff they're watching. The oven has fallen off here. The other side, here is our motif again with clearly male guardians. So are these perhaps the maltsters, and are we seeing some sort of gendered work here that they always seem to be depicted as males? This is the one motif that appears on every single one of these vessels. There's always a person sitting back with a little miniature pot and a big smile on their face, or sometimes it's a couple sitting back, but the end of this cycle is the person who gets to sit back and enjoy the fruits of their labour. We did experimental archaeology. We attempted to recreate our feature 33 with a modern pithos from a garden centre. And the beginning efforts, not really up to Bronze Age standard, a little bit sort of conical rather than domed. You can see we did successfully malt grain, and we used, again, smashed garden centre pots and other receptacles, and it works perfectly. The final attempt does look very good. And you can see here, with this effect of the drying kiln, the fire in the pithos circulates hot air through the dome. The basal temperature remains at 65 degrees. In the top of the dome, you get about 200, so perfect for smoking meats or other drying fruits, whatever you want to be doing, but it works. And then we made beer, and we learned perhaps that they might not have done it in the middle of summer because it very quickly goes mouldy, but it worked with about 2.5% alcohol content. Some batches were tastier than others. We did try figs as an ingredient, and that seemed to help. But generally speaking, beer made in the Cypriot summer without refrigeration smells very much like halloumi. But it does not taste very good. So coming back to our animals, and we've seen that they already are featured in all of these everyday life things as just part of what the village is getting on with. Cattle are particularly important. They are reintroduced at the beginning of the Bronze Age, this filiar phase, after they had been introduced in the early Aceramic Neolithic, but had died out by about 7000 BC. So they come back with the Bronze Age, and with this comes a conversion from hoe agriculture to plough agriculture. Again, one of our nice scenic compositions exactly illustrating this. We find shrine models, a couple of those, with apparently a person pouring libations, perhaps, standing there against this tripartite shrine mounted by Bucrania. We find detailed bull figures in tombs, and then these sort of rougher little figurines are found in settlement contexts. Cattle are the largest, most powerful beast on Cyprus at this time, and they very quickly become the most important figurative repertoire in the early Bronze Age, with 2/3 of depictions of animals being cattle at this time. They are clearly important symbolic animals as well as important animals for getting on with life. You have a chance to clear greater areas of land, in tandem, of course, with the introduction of copper tools we're talking about here. You can exploit more marginal soils. You have the beast useful for other reasons. You've got, of course, a large meat source, and by volume of meat per animal, Paul Croft's studies have indicated that beef was the major meat source of much of the early Middle Bronze Age. And then you've got, of course, the milk, the cheese, the hides, the other benefits. But what you need is someone to tell you what to do with the cow, because they need a longer care when they're smaller than the other animals. You need to know how to house them, how to feed them, how to care for them, how to harness them to a plough. These are all types of information that have to be shared between people, and for this to happen, they have to be shared with people from people off island. Coming to our other feature in the north of the site, which is not as well constructed as feature 33, but it's about 4 by 2.5 meters in size. It's quite substantial. In the entranceway, in our final haphazard phase again, when they were just sort of using it for smaller scale activities, we found our lovely plain white pithos in the entrance, and inside this fill was where we found our plain white wheel-made jar. It seems that they have reduced the scale again. We've got little pits again for just heating and cooking. A post support was put in the middle, and it's, again, when we get to the construction phase, you can see that this has a very nice hard mud plaster floor again. It's only 1 row of stones by 3 or 4 courses. It couldn't have ever been a high substantial wall around it, but enough to keep the wind away from whatever it was they were doing in there. And what they first did in there, apparently, when they inaugurated this structure, was deposited on the base a little bull figurine. And then it was filled with ashy debris, and some cooking was going on in there. So he is perhaps an oxen, if this is an indication of musculature here. There's a harness around his horns, and most importantly, the horns, the tail, all the feet have been deliberately smashed off before it was deposited. This is a very hard-baked object. This is not accidental object damage, so we're dealing with this figurine being killed before deposited in this feature, large enough to roast a whole ox, perhaps. And we have other parallels for the killing of objects deposited in tombs. Copper spearheads are bent, and the plank idol figures, Daisy Knox's research suggested they were deliberately snapped into before being deposited in tombs on occasion. So we then move southwards to what the very few areas we could call a room, but again, it's not exactly right angles, it's all a bit sort of off, but it was a very interesting area where we found, as we were working, a boar mandible fallen on the outside of the wall, presumably fallen down from where it was displayed. And on the interior, this great big dump of lots of fineware pottery, little cups, juglets, jugs, and 2 complete deer antler sets with a little bit of the cranial fragments still joining them together in the middle. And this very sweet juglet, fresh break where the handle was because the plough tine just nicked off that handle. Just you can see how amazing it is that we have any of this left at all. As we excavated down to try and understand the sequences of construction in this area, we came upon a very exciting feature, which is a pit containing 5 adult cow skulls. And the sequence of construction in here is that our courtyard wall, this is the outside of the courtyard, was built. A pit was dug into which these 5 cow skulls were deposited, along with stones and a small sheep-goat skull. Then this floor was laid over it, up against the wall, and these benches were built over the top. So we really can say that it very much looks like this should be interpreted as some sort of foundation deposit associated with construction of the final phase complex. And this is not a common feature of the Cypriot Bronze Age. At any time, there are only very rare examples of this occurring. And the skulls themselves, no mandibles, no teeth whatsoever, and they have all been deliberately shaped before being deposited, but sadly preservation was not good enough to say whether they might have been wearing as masks or just for mounting on the walls. But it's a very exciting discovery. And then miniatures. This miniature bowl deposited within the wall matrix, and we have some other, not masses of miniatures, but some miniatures deposited around about the site. So what we don't have, and these are the plank idols, this is a break across here that I was talking about. We do not seem to have any of these after all these seasons of excavation, even though they are around the rest of the island. We do have figurative evidence, some other fragmentary protomes. This may have been a freestanding figurine, but hard to tell from this evidence. And what we also have are strangely rare figurine types. You have to perhaps take my word for it that these are knees, these are little feet, so that's the lower part of a figurine. This is one breast, and there is an incision running down the side, so that's a torso of another. These are only known from unprovenanced examples, but they're clearly of Eastern Cypriot clay. They go with the plain white handmade pithos, and they're just a little blip in the figurine record of production of Bronze Age Cyprus that quickly vanishes. Proceeding southwards, we decided to see what was south of that wall with the cow skulls in it, and we found that what we thought was our lovely courtyard with parallel walls, in fact, is now L-shaped. So it extends out here beyond where our malting kiln was. Very nice in situ quern and rubber here next to this rectilinear lime plaster lined basin. And more ash started to come up. So, okay, we have another fire installation here. Let's see what this turns out to be. And we have a brand new oven in the last couple of seasons, which is over 4 meters in diameter and takes up the entire corner of that L shape. This here is where the malting kiln is, so it's really right adjacent to it. You can see here. And most interesting here is perhaps right next to this new oven, which is currently just half sectioned. There's this conical pit with this circular ash-filled hole, and then on the interior of the oven mud plaster is another hole. They seem to want to join up. And maybe our tube might have something to do with being a flue connecting this pit to pumping air into that oven. But I would really welcome any ideas people might have about that. What were they making in this new oven then? And you can sort of get an idea of the scale of it from Ellen, who's been working very hard as supervisor in this area for a long time. Leilani Lucas, again, our archaeobotanist, has identified terebinths alongside amorphous food lumps. And it looks perhaps like we have what is known on Cyprus as the traditional snack Tremithopithus. And this is like a hard-baked biscuit with terebinth seeds in it. Terebinth seeds are known for their medicinal antiseptic qualities, very nutritious, not a flavour for everyone perhaps. And these biscuits are quite tough on the teeth as well, but it would be very interesting if we can take Tremithopithus back to the Bronze Age. We also have a little bit of grape, we have some capers, some nice bits and pieces coming up. But apart from what they were making in there, what they were doing in there, we now have 2 paleofeces. We don't know if they're human or animal, dog or perhaps another animal. We're able to identify these because our next door neighbours in the next village excavating at Chloricus Pelurus have had 20 of these turning up in their abandoned Chalcolithic houses. So they've got the skill set to know that there's a certain concave fracture and a certain porosity on the exterior and difference on the interior. But we're very much excited to collaborate with them for some analyses to find out what kind of animal it was, what they were eating, what diseases they might have had. So that's something for the future. So bringing all this together, I think it's probable that we are looking at the whole community being involved in this massive organised production, and that work feasts were an important part of this. The production of the beer, perhaps earlier in this informal ashy scoop situation, later formalised within the courtyard, and perhaps the roasting of oxen, the sitting in the area with the fine feasting wares. Whether it was cooperation or coercion is uncertain at this stage, but at this time of rapid change, at this time of strangers, both from other parts of Cyprus and from across the sea, then really these eating and drinking events together would have been quite necessary. And the animals clearly play a key role, both in symbolic worlds and in a practical sense, and were definitely considered a part of the community. And the people of Kassonakis were certainly clearly interested in adopting new ideas, interacting with the outside world on Cyprus and beyond. But they did not make it to being a successful late Bronze Age town, such as we see at Enkami and other sites. And this is most probably because they only had that tiny little anchorage, they didn't have access to major copper sources readily, and they probably, in the end, gave up and moved to somewhere like Paleipaphos or Tumbatuskuru, which then did become successful Bronze Age towns. And our little smiley fellow here, who looks like he's just having a good time, he was in fact also put to work. When he was knocked off his pot, he was modified to fit in someone's hand and used as the handle of a bow drill, as you can see in the incisions there. So thank you very much. Thank you to the Department of Antiquities and to the students and team members who work so hard in the hot season every summer, and little Darcy the dig dog. Thank you.